Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Webcast with Director John Malloy. My name is Mary Linton, and to my far left is Ralph Nigro. And John, on behalf of TSA, we want to thank you for allowing us to work with you on this webcast. Now, John has promised that this will not be the only opportunity to sit down and chat with him, and he wants to keep it casual. We tried to get him out of the tie, but he's still wearing his tie. First of all, I'd like to just take a minute and talk about the agenda for today's session. The meeting will be approximately 1 hour long. John will begin with a presentation on education centers, guiding principles, and the many conversations that he has had to get us to this point. Followed by, he'll address some of the themes from questions that were raised at the January meeting. And then at the end of the meeting, there'll be time for live questions. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions to Ralph and I. We have those questions here. They're collated and ready to go, but we really want to encourage you to send your questions in via the chat box. And we have a great communication team here, and Irene Fu will be holding on to the questions, and once the director is ready to open up for questions, they will be released. And what you will see is Ralph and I will piggyback on questions. Ralph has many of the prepared questions, and once we start, I'll be going online and looking to see the questions that the director will share. So finally, there will be a video of this session, and it will be available to you afterwards. So I'd like to turn it over to John Malloy.
Thank you so much, Mary, and it is really great to be here with you again. I know this is a different way of connecting. We'll see how it goes, and we'll appreciate your feedback as we move forward. So I want to start by thanking you for your time, thanking you for your leadership, and in a special way, I also want to put out my thanks and gratitude on behalf of all of us to our secondary administrators who continue to deal with the challenge of sanctions. And again, I trust that we're all working together to support the work, but we also know how important your leadership is in that context. So a very special thank you to all for this afternoon. I just want to start by setting the themes that have evolved over the last 3 months since I first met with you, and then move into some discussion around the learning centers, and then, as Mary so aptly suggested, I'll be open for all of your questions. Some of the themes that you have communicated to me in a multitude of ways are the following. Instructional leadership is most important to you, and meaningful supports for that instructional leadership is key. And some of the things that you spoke to me about are the importance of central office not distracting from the work that you wish to do in schools, that central supports and services need to be accessible, that labor challenges continue to exist, and that administrative requirements that appear to be unnecessary are still potential problems. These are things that we are looking at, and I'll be able to speak more about, but I was really pleased to see that the first and foremost theme that emerged was instructional leadership. You also spoke about the importance of superintendents being available to you, available to provide insight, support, collaboration. You asked that processes be streamlined. A perfect example is the whole concept of the school improvement plan and the requirements within that, something that I will speak about in a few minutes. Reducing the number of initiatives is absolutely paramount for many of you, and I think you'll hear your voice in some of the directions that I'm going to communicate. You asked that administrators be valued and acknowledged for the significant work that you do. And I know that I can certainly state that today, and I can sincerely mean that. However, our actions also need to show how we are actually going to do that. And to that end, you talked about authentic consultation and collaboration, understanding what it is that we are doing at the system level, but ensuring that not only do you learn about it first, but that you are informing that direction. And that would be one of the ways in which we can truly show you that your voice and your leadership matter. And last comment in terms of the themes is the importance of trust. You spoke often that if we are going to share leadership and work together, trust needs to be present, and we need to work towards that each and every day. I asked you about norms, processes, and structures, and you spoke that the leadership team meetings are effective. You have cautioned about how we balance between secondary and elementary, how we meet the needs so that your time is effective, and we've got some plans on how we can do that. You also suggested that information sharing alone at meetings is really not the best use of your time, especially when we can certainly send that in other ways so that the opportunities to come together are really about the learning, about the engaging, about the leading, not simply the hearing. And the whole notion of senior teams' involvement in area meetings emerged a lot, and I'll be working closely with Mary and Ralph and others to figure out what that might look like going forward. Last comment from what you shared with me, and then I'm going to move very quickly into what I would like for us to do together in light of this information. In terms of priorities, early literacy and numeracy emerged often. The importance of coaches was suggested regularly. Equity, closing the gap, very important. Mental health and well-being, professional learning, and technology. You spoke about these themes in many different ways, and again, my hope now as I move into how it is that I would like for us to consider, or how it is I'd like us to consider proceeding, I'm hoping that, as I said earlier, your voice is a part of that. The most exciting thing for me, and I want to really state this clearly, is in everything that we have received from you, it acknowledges that there have been challenges, it acknowledges that change is required, but it also spoke about a strong desire to move forward in a positive way. And there is nothing more important for our staff and our students and our communities than that, as far as I'm concerned. So thank you for those that feedback. And now if I could just turn a little bit to, so what? What's going to happen because of what has been shared? And I also want to thank the senior team who has spent countless hours in the last 3 months working closely with me as we not only work with you, but also work together to create these directions. And what has emerged and what it is that I'm putting on the table are the following. Leadership and culture are front and center in terms of the work that we're going to do together. Relationships and partnerships are key. Leadership, as I defined earlier with you, is not only those of us in positions of leadership, but how we create the conditions for everyone to share their expertise and experience. We'll speak more about this in a minute. The second key area of focus is coherence and focus. Forgive the use of the word twice, but I'm going to explain. You asked for streamlined school improvement processes. You asked for a decrease in the number of initiatives. And this is what we're putting on the table. And this is what we still will need to work on together. But the plan going forward around school improvement is that we would expect each school to have an achievement goal, a well-being goal, and an equity goal. That focus, or those three areas of focus, will be determined by you and your staff focusing on your students. This focus then becomes the foundation for the inquiry work that you'll be doing at your school. You will have voice in terms of the evidence you will accept as a sign of improvement in these areas. And as you have asked, you will be responsible for communicating and showing that improvement. That will be the priority. That will be the work. The work will not be coming from other places. The work of the system will be to support this improvement work at your school. So you might ask, how are we going to support that? We have looked at all of our resources that exist in TDSB around learning. And based upon a strong and rich foundation of literacy and numeracy, and understanding the importance of changing learning environments so that our students are engaged, that ownership happens, that they are thinking critically, that they are creating, they are collaborating, they are communicating, we understand that technology is significant to that. So when we speak about creating an achievement goal on that foundation, part of our expectation is that deep learning, that transformed learning, that learning that is supported by technology would be a part of that. And we're pulling together all of our insights resources into one very brief document that will support that part of our improvement process. In terms of well-being, again, we have plenty of resources We have much that has been written. We have many different expectations that have been communicated, and all of us know about the importance of staff and student well-being. Again, we're going to pull all of those rich resources into a very brief and concise, supportive document that will assist you. In terms of equity, our TDSB commitment to equity is strong, and our themes that you shared with us suggest that. But we know that in each and every community, the discussion around who needs additional supports to achieve will be different. But we will be inviting you and your staff to engage in discussions whereby you look at who's struggling to achieve. You determine what the barriers are to that achievement. You look at the various things that are happening in your school, and from all of that evidence, you make a decision regarding the equity focus that will be taken in your school with rationale for why that is the case. So what I'm explaining here is one improvement process that is connected to 3 key areas that the entire system will support, and that we will not be inviting you to other types of learning opportunities that are separate from that, but that we will look at ways to network those of you who are engaged in similar learning goals. Our system expectations: every school, department, and staff member is engaged in learning and improvement, and inquiry as at the foundation. All students reading by the end of grade 1 has emerged and will continue to be one of our expectations. Ensuring that effective interventions are provided for our older students who are struggling with reading is something that we're exploring. Renewing our focus on how to discern students' mathematical skill and knowledge in order to provide effective instruction is key. All of our departments creating and implementing plans for service excellence is on the table. Each student having access to a caring adult and a culture of high expectation is an aspirational goal. All students graduating or receiving a graduation certificate is our commitment. To that end, you've heard from Mary and Ralph, and you may have seen from our board's previous meeting last week that we are moving towards the concept of learning centers. And to speak briefly about the learning centers, we do believe in coherence, but we also understand that for collaboration to be effective, for responsiveness to be key, we need to be sure that we are organized in a way for these rich relationships to be the type that then support student achievement and well-being with an eye on equitable access and outcomes. And though the actual specifics to this plan are still in process, I do wish to say that what we're planning to do is ensure that superintendents of schools have fewer schools, that there are fewer members of senior team that will be working in the center of the board, if you will, and each of the centers will be supported by an executive superintendent that will support the work in those centers. Similarly, we are expanding our cadre of coaches, both in terms of curriculum, teaching, learning, instruction, as well as special education. And those supports will be much more connected to schools, because what will happen is at the center level with a number of superintendents and the executive superintendent working closely with you, supports can be provided in a differentiated way. The other purpose of the centers is to ensure that your voices are heard, that context is honored, and that the very focused direction that I've just shared with you around school improvement is supported. It also allows us to look at how we're serving our schools so that schools feel that we're responding to you and that you do not feel that you are responding to the board in the way in which it sometimes is experienced, that everything required is coming from somewhere else, as opposed to coming from your students whose needs are clear to you and your staffs whose capacity needs are clear to you, so that we can make the difference that we require. So there's more to come on the learning centers. But I do hope that from what I've shared with you in these first 15 minutes, you're hearing that we do understand the significant leadership that you provide each day. We do understand the importance of the conditions that you create with your staff to serve students. And we do understand the importance of a system to be responsive to those needs. And to that end, I hope that through the focus areas you've heard me speak about, as well as some of the structures that emerge from these very important directions, that to this point, those suggestions that you have provided are here, are present, and that in the days, weeks, and months to come, we'll continue to hear from you, we'll continue to respond, and hopefully come September 1st, we'll be in a place where any of the changes that are being discussed right now are ready to be implemented. Last comment. We're not doing this because we're simply changing. We're doing this because you have provided insights, senior team has provided insight, our Board of Trustees has offered suggestions, and our wider community has also communicated some of these clear guiding principles that will help us move forward. So I'm going to stop there. Again, I was asked to stay to 15 minutes, and I think that I'm right on time, and I'll stop and we'll turn this over to questions and some engagement, and we'll go from there.
I guess I'll start with the first question, and thanks, John. And we have a number of questions that have been given to us by our principal and vice principal members. And just sticking with the theme of learning centers, I think you referenced the fact that we're looking at a September 1st potential phase-in. A number of our members have asked about the concept of executive authority, and if you could define that perhaps in greater detail and what that would look like in an operational setting.
So as I envision the Learning Center idea, right now we have a model where there is one superintendent working with, I'll say, 30 principals in 30 schools, and of course the vice principals as well. And that unit operates somewhat in an individual fashion. One of the things we say to our teachers all the time is that when you as teachers are collaborating with one another, and when our principals and vice principals are learning with staff, great things happen. Similarly, senior team needs to be organized in a way where we are structured to learn together, to learn with you, and to provide the kinds of supports I've described. The role of the executive superintendent working more closely with a group of superintendents in a learning center is so that they can help facilitate, they can help coordinate, they can help connect the work of the center to the system. We want to be sure that we keep a certain system coherence, and that they can support decision making, and they can support the work that needs to happen. In other words, I don't feel that everything that happens in the TDSB needs to make its way into our, to use a building, 50-50 facility. And I think that some of the decision making and some of the service needs to be much closer to the schools and the communities that the schools are serving. And my hope would be is that the superintendents working with the executive superintendent can serve principals better, because I know some of you have asked me, well, is this just an extra step? And the answer to that is no, because my expectation in this model is superintendents have the authority to respond, and where response isn't possible, executive superintendents from the center can actually influence other departments as required to provide the responses needed.
So if we could stick with the theme of bringing the resources closer to the school, we are in the middle of a reorganization of our central teaching positions and coaches. And a number of questions were posed by principals and vice principals. So if we pick something like ensuring that all students will read by the end of grade 1. So in an individual school, if the staff and the principal and vice principal determine in December or January that maybe they require additional support to achieve that target, how would they go about accessing those resources, and what would the support look like at the individual school level?
So the plan as we envision it is that each center will have a number of instructional coaches, They will have a myriad of specialties, whether it might be curriculum, or it might be digital literacy, or it might be special education, it might be early literacy. And that cadre of coaches will be there for the service of those schools. When a superintendent and a principal are working together on the student data in that particular school, and the conversation emerges that we have a large number of students, for instance, who aren't reading effectively, or whose oral language development in kindergarten seems to be challenged, it will be then in that discussion that together it will be determined how to move forward. So for example, if that's the issue, if that's the student need, then there's an expectation that there be a capacity plan on how we're going to support teachers developed around that. And then the coaches have a place, an intentional place to meet teachers and principals and vice principals in order to make that difference. So we see it as more fluid, more flexible, differentiated. We also have heard you, because you basically asked of me through much of what you've shared, that if those charged with changing and impacting and influencing instruction have too many central administrative responsibilities, their presence is not felt in the school. And our plan going forward is that the majority of these professionals' time will be available to principals, vice principals, and superintendents in schools, so teachers are supported.
Just to follow up with that question around resources, you talked about a conversation with the superintendent, the principal would have a conversation. Can you talk about, will there be paperwork to fill out? Because sometimes that's what really slows things down for people. There's 2 or 3 pieces of paperwork that have to be sent through, and can you comment on that?
Yes. I know that sometimes paperwork is required, and sometimes we may not have control over that paperwork. If, for instance, the ministry is asking for something. However, I believe that for the most part, that type of paperwork should not be distracting the work of student learning, staff capacity building, and improvement in schools. And to that end, when I speak about a school improvement process, I'm much more interested in the dynamic dialogue that needs to happen and less about what's actually on a piece of paper. Having said that, though, I do know from some of the work of Stephen Katz and others that if we are to truly move the learning agenda forward, there needs to be some ability to capture where learning is at any time. So I would prefer that paperwork not simply be reports that are being sent to other places, but rather the creation of some really effective documentation that moves the learning forward at school level, that's owned by the school staff, that is the responsibility of the principal and vice principal in consultation with the superintendent. To answer your question briefly, very few documents, but certainly the ones that we do have connected to the improvement process should be focused, should be contextual, and should meet the needs of those of you who are charged with this important work of improvement.
Okay. And so we talked about a conversation with the superintendent. So how can we build a culture of trust? We've had that culture of fear and we need to move out of it. Can you talk about ways that you're looking at building a culture of trust?
Thank you. And I do accept the fact that there has been the use of the term culture of fear, and that has been real, and I'm not going to certainly sidestep that. And I also appreciate that the opposite of fear is trust. Mm-hmm. And we can't throw that word around without actually, again, having something to back it up. And to that end, and I started to share this with all of you principals and vice principals in January, and I still hold true to this. Relationships are key to creating cultures of trust. The only way we can be in relationship with each other is if there's time to do so. There is not time to do so if there are too many distractions on the plate. Specific to the important relationship between principal and superintendent, which I again have shared with you, I believe is most important. Why? Because you as principals and vice principals are connected to the community, to the students, to the staff. Senior team, the superintendent, is connected to the system, to the board, and in some ways more intimately to that which comes from other places such as the ministry. I expect, in order for this improvement to take place, that pivotal relationship is the one that allows us to influence the entire direction forward, to influence each other. And I believe that when that relationship is solid, that we start to dispel some of these fearful pieces. I've heard a lot about, if I speak honestly, what might the consequence be? Or I've heard that if I'm too direct in my response, might that offend and might that in some way impact where I'm placed next year? I've heard these things, and I'm not willing to sidestep them, as I said earlier, but I do want to say that our commitment as a senior team, we've worked almost weekly on this for the last number of weeks, and I'm not suggesting they haven't before, but I can say that in the time I've been with them, that we want to work with principals and vice principals on this relationship. We want to give superintendents more time to be in that relationship. We want less distractions coming from other places, and we're simply going to ask you to work with us, and as we go forward, to review how we're doing, and we'll make adjustments as we go, because as you said, Mary, this is not the only time we're going to be having this conversation. This is our most significant piece of work, in my opinion, to create the kind of leadership culture that brings about the important work for students that can only happen if we're working together in this shared way.
John, if we could pick up on the point that you made about superintendents having an opportunity to spend more time with their administrators and getting into their schools. With the reorg, there's been discussion about having additional FOS superintendents, but that those superintendents would also pick up portfolios. And a number of our principals and vice principals have asked, how can they do both? And can you maybe elaborate on
Yes.
that and give us an idea of what that will look like?
Thanks for the question. I'm glad you asked it, because I've come to learn that the term portfolio has many different definitions, and many of the definitions that I've heard are actually not the ones that we intend. The more common definition of portfolio is that a superintendent is given a responsibility, and that responsibility to do something on the system level, if we're not careful, can become yet another piece of work that's coming from another place that principals and vice principals are expected to implement. That's a definition of portfolio that I've heard previously, and that's actually not on the table in this discussion. What's on the table in this discussion is that if we move to potentially, and again, don't quote me on the numbers because we're still working through this, potentially 4 learning centers. And if 4 learning centers have 7 superintendents and an executive superintendent. One of the things we do not want to have happen is 4 distinct communities. So when I speak about a coordinating function, we will still keep some executive staff at the board level. It's required. Of course, there are positions such as employee services, teaching and learning, special education, to name a few, that we do need a central board leadership, because there's so much that needs to be coordinated. However, if we're going to understand this concept of context, and we're going to understand the importance of voice, the role of superintendents having a coordinating function in each center is not to create different work, but to actually be the conduit. So there'll be a coordinating function in teaching and learning, a coordinating function in special education, a coordinating function in digital literacy, to mention a few, that align with system work, not to create different work, but to ensure the responsiveness that we've just described. So in other words, the superintendent in the center who's responsible for special education will work closely with the board teaching and learning or special education staff, and be sure that the voices of principals, vice principals, staff, and students are influencing central direction, while central direction is deeply understood by someone from the center, so that we don't have this broken telephone that comes from too many people who have a piece of the information, and that by the time it gets to the schools, it might not be clear enough, or it might not actually be understood. That's one side of this. On the other side of this, we don't want anything to come from the central board leadership that can't be implemented, that isn't flowing from your student learning focus or your staff's learning need. And that's what we mean when we say superintendents in centers will have a coordinating function to be that bridge and to be that link.
Okay. So we have about 10 more minutes before we open up for questions. Did you have something else that you wanted to expand on? You have lots of notes, and you were brief, so that was good.
I've been told that my TDSB growth plan is that I'm working on brevity, so I'm hoping that you can offer me feedback if I'm succeeding. I actually think that I'll simply close the portion that I wish to share by saying that I am very optimistic. I'm optimistic because everywhere I go in TDSB, and every principal and vice principal I meet, and the good news is I've gotten to meet many of you personally because I've been making my way to trustee ward forums, and many of you are there. And so I get to meet many of the principals and vice principals. Everywhere I go, I'm hearing an interest in working effectively together. I'm hearing a desire to focus. I'm hearing an understanding that some change is required, but I'm also hearing a willingness from you to actually influence that change. That connected to a senior team who I've been working with, as you know, for the last 3 months, and all I've experienced to the very challenging discussions I put on the table is an openness, a wisdom, and a desire to do the same. We may not have all of the pieces of the puzzle sorted out today. We will be moving quickly though. I want to be absolutely clear with you that the guiding principles have been passed by the board, and organizational structure flowing from these guiding principles should be ready within the next 2 weeks. We're going to move quickly to do our hiring so that school-based staffing isn't in any way jeopardized, and we understand the dates to make that so, with a goal by May 1st, having everybody in the places that they need to be from a learning center and board center place, so that we can spend May and June ensuring that we work out all the operational challenges that might emerge. At any time, I continue to invite your influence. I ask the family of school superintendents each week to be sure to share everything that they hear. I meet with my 2 colleagues regularly, and we actually are on a bit of speed dial and on email quite regularly. However you wish to share the information, the insight, we're open to it. And I think together we can create the kind of culture that's focused on learning, that understands innovation and the transformations that we're all striving for, and at the end of the day, our students will be best served, and our staffs will be well supported, and our parents and communities will be engaged. That may sound like an idealistic statement, but one that I actually believe is possible as long as we all stay very connected, working together. So I think, Ralph and Mary, those would be my last comments that I needed to share at this point. Okay. And I'm open to any questions that our principals and vice principals might have.
So maybe we can open it up, and I have another question. We have a number of questions that we can get. Can I put one in?
Go ahead.
Just from vice principals. So there's been talk about the relationship between superintendents and principals. And so vice principals, we've heard from them, want to know where do they fit in that leadership. Sometimes they feel sort of left on an island. If you could comment.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. And you know, I try to catch my language, and I don't think I'm always successful. So I do want to apologize a bit. I oftentimes try to say principals and vice principals because I like that term better than administrators. Not that I'm against the word administrators, but I do believe that there's something more personal in principals and vice principals. And I do know that sometimes I might forget to mention vice principals. So first of all, let me say that when I'm speaking about this important work, I'm speaking about principals and vice principals. When I'm speaking about this important work, I'm speaking about superintendents, principals, and vice principals, and I appreciate your reflection on that. And the other very important piece about this is our vice principals, you are so important to this work, not only now, but going forward. Our job is to provide you all the resources, all the supports, the learning community, so that you can be amazing in the work of leadership and move in continual leadership opportunities in the future. So you are very much a part of this process. You are not separate from this process, and if we need to look at different ways to include you in it, because you might not feel that way right now, we're open to hearing what that looks like and sounds like.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I think, sticking to guiding principle number 1, a number of our principals and vice principals have raised it, and you addressed it in your comments, the issue of mental health and well-being, not just for students, but for staff members as well. And all principals and vice principals know that a focus on this is extremely important, but they talk about the resources that are available. They talk about social work support 1 day a week, guidance counselor support at most 1 day a week, and should an emergency occur somewhere else, they may not even get that. So what they are asking is it possible to stay focused to those issues and address the concerns and the needs of the school, and can we provide more resources while trying to balance our budget?
Right. So again, in the spirit of being frank, which I think those of you who've gotten to know me a little bit know that I always try to do, we aren't going to be able to have more resources. There's just not the ability to have more resources. However, there are a couple of things that we are doing. We are looking at the resources that we have, the impacts of those resources, to ensure that they are actually meeting our needs right now. Secondly, because the challenges are so great and you are dealing with them on a daily basis, one of the reasons why we're trying to create a bit more of a differentiated model that is closer to the schools through the learning centers is it will hopefully, and again, we're going to need to work this out and we're going to need your help in the process, it's going to help us think much more in a differentiated fashion, meaning some of our schools actually do not have the same level of need as it comes to, or when we're referring to issues of students with special needs or issues with students and mental health. Some of our schools don't have the same level of need. Now, I understand that in every school there is need. And I do understand that it's a real challenging discussion when we're trying to figure out who deserves what kind of resource. I wish we had the ability to have more, but in the spirit that we don't, our commitment will be to listen to you as you share who your students are and what your students need, and that through the Learning Center, we do our best to respond to those needs, which may mean that some schools, since in the past I've come to learn that we may have done some of this staffing through formula, we may have to shift that thinking. And the only way to shift formulaic thinking, in my experience, is for it to be based upon students, schools, principals and superintendents and vice principals having conversations regarding how to proceed. Not an easy answer. I wish I could say more, but we're going to have to wrestle with this challenge within the context of existing resources, because as I'm sure everyone knows, there aren't more resources coming from any place at this time.
Okay, and we have a few questions that have come in. So this is around resources. It's from Peter. In the context of streamlining and offering high quality services, and in regard to older students with literacy challenges, I have been able to see the work of reading recovery teachers over the last few years. Will you be considering revamping this program?
So one of the things that's become clear to us is that not only do we want to be sure that all students are reading by the end of grade 1, and we understand the important and significant developments that need to happen in order for that to take place, but we also need to ensure that those students who are older and aren't able to read are supported. And to that end, without more resources, this becomes a bit more challenging. So what we're looking at is a couple of things. One, what do we know about effective instruction when we're dealing with students who are struggling in this way? How do we provide supports through classroom teachers? When interventions are required, who can provide those interventions, whether it be someone in special education, whether it be someone such as reading recovery, or one of our early literacy coaches, which is a position that we will be posting shortly, as well as what do we do in terms of through our student success work with our older students that might be struggling. So at this point, it's too early for me to say that something will be revamped or reviewed, except to say we're leveraging, we're reviewing, and we're exploring everything that presently exists in our system, everything that's working in various parts of our system that might not yet be systemic yet, and then we're looking at what we might not do in order for us to actually do some things more effectively. That's going to be a process that takes us into next year, though. So I want to be, again, upfront about that. Having said that, though, we're going to be really careful starting right in September that there are additional resources specific to this need. Will they be enough? Again, I wish there were more, but at least it's a start, and we're going to continue the work.
Okay, another question here from Marilyn, wondering about inclusion. Why are the gifted classes still being sent to other schools? Why not have every FOS have a local program?
So one of the things I said to Mary and Ralph when we started is there are some topics that I'm pretty on top of. just because of the nature of things that have happened since I arrived. And there are other topics that I promised senior team yesterday. I would be sure that not only would I say to you that I need to learn more about it, but that we'd be sure to close the loop. Because again, some of you have shared that when the language is used, I'll take that back, that sometimes an answer isn't forthcoming. So in the spirit of an answer will be forthcoming, I will learn a bit more about how we structure our gifted programs right now. I will see how the gifted process and placement can somehow connect down the road to our centers, and I will work to provide a better answer than the one I just gave.
Okay. Now the questions are coming in. So once again, we'll do our best to get through all of these questions. The questions that we aren't able to address on this particular webinar, Ralph and I will continue to bring them back to the director. So they're coming in. This one's around the culture of fear. The culture of fear is real. How are principals able to be radically honest when an SO seems to be pressured or to pressure us into supporting a persistent parent or trustee, which is not necessarily in the best interest of the school? So it's around having those courageous conversations.
Yes. One of the things that I shared with you in January, and I'm going to allude to again, is that I start from a place that everybody's perspective and perception is real. And that even if I might disagree from my own perspective with that perception, it's still something that needs to be acknowledged. The only way to work through these kinds of challenges, in my experience, is if we create the kind of space or conditions, as I've mentioned previously, to work that through. It can appear to be challenging when somebody feels that a superintendent is being pressured from somewhere else, or a principal isn't being supported, if there isn't agreement to what's happening on the table. That's the messiness of our leadership work. So what I've shared with the trustees, what I've shared with the senior team, and what I'm sharing with you now is that as long as all voices are heard, there is an understanding that people's perspectives and perception is a truth to them, and that we've created the best space possible to work through those conflicts. That would be my hope in terms of moving through some of these concerns around culture and fear. Because again, I have heard in the short time I've been with you that sometimes if we move too quickly to a resolve or a conclusion without taking into account all the various concerns, that might not bring us to a good place. The other thing that might not bring us to a good place is if it becomes personal, as opposed to thinking about the principles that are underlying it. So all that I can say in response, because obviously each circumstance is unique, each circumstance has its own set of conditions, but that our expectation is that we work together, that we create space to listen to one another, that we do our best to bring about a resolution. And when there isn't the ability to bring about a resolution, we do it in a way that people feel respected, even if they aren't being agreed with. And again, easier said than done, but that's what we are consciously and explicitly working on as we move forward in terms of the cultural piece.
If I could just, John, questions have been coming in since the beginning of the year on this particular topic in the area of technology. There are a number of schools that have been impacted by some issues around one of our internet service providers, and it's affected the bandwidth in their schools, and it's made it a real challenge in some cases for them to even complete daily tasks, administrative tasks in the office, not to mention the need for the Wi-Fi in classrooms as a learning tool. Would you be able to bring us up to date on where we stand with that, and any timelines around a possible resolution to this issue?
Thank you, Ralph. Let me start by saying that when I spoke earlier about a vision for learning in TDSB that not only speaks about the importance of literacy and numeracy, but also transforms the learning environment so our students can experience all kinds of amazing things, is one that does need technology and digital resources to be successful. And our professional learning needs to include technology and digital resources, not as a focus in and of itself, but rather something that allows our students and our staff to move forward in this way. Clearly, we can't do that without the highway, the bandwidth, the Wi-Fi. And I understand that about 200 of our schools are being challenged by this right now. Because there are some things that are being worked on as we speak that I can't speak any more explicitly about, and I'll trust you'll understand some of the reasons for that. I will say that I have been brought up to speed on this issue most recently, that I have communicated my expectation that we work as diligently as possible to be sure this situation is rectified by September, and that all of the schools involved, we're going to keep in close contact with you if for whatever reason we're simply not able to make that commitment. However, right now that's the commitment that's on the table. There's a plan that's being worked on. It's a complex plan, I'm going to say that, but it's one that we are committed to making happen so that that transformative learning vision that I spoke about earlier can become a reality. And right now I understand it's not a reality if you don't have the tools or the highway.
Question just came in from Mark. Many of our schools are old, poorly maintained, and lack the facilities to support 21st century learning. What plans are you considering to improve the conditions in which our students and staff learn and work?
One of our challenges, as you know better than I, is that with finite resources, we need to be as intentional as possible regarding how we use them. And I don't need to go into all the details about what might cause some of those challenges. I think all of you would be very understanding of what those might be. What we're trying to look at is how do we, let me back up. Where I would like to start this conversation is what do our students and staff and our leadership deserve in terms of the learning environment? The next question becomes, so what then does that mean, or what does that mean for our programs and access to programs? And I'm not necessarily speaking about specialty programs, I'm talking about programs in each and every school. And then what does that mean in terms of our accommodation requirements and our capital decisions? I've raised this issue with the board. They're working with me on creating a strategy around this. But in the big picture, we really need to wrestle this particular issue to the ground so that we can actually release some of our resources to be able to ensure that the learning environments are effective. Realizing that that may take a while, we do have some principles that we follow. Principles as in PLES principles. And that is, of course, health and safety are first and foremost. That our learning environments need to be, for lack of a better term, 21st century learning environments. And those are our priorities. So I simply need to say that we need to do a lot better. We're trying to figure out ways to be better, but we have some challenges that we're strategically reviewing so that we can get an implementation plan that makes a difference. So I'm still a little early on that, but I hear you and we're working hard.
Okay. Another question in from Janice. What strategies are you thinking about to engage and support our middle school learners? This connects to the idea of reading, at-risk students, and differentiation.
So I think thank you for the question, because I think it allows me one more chance to speak to what I hope becomes our work together. A system, if the system speaks about what needs to happen in 588 schools, short of some really important guiding principles, we might actually get in the way of the work that you need to do. So if we go back to the concept of you as principals and vice principals lead your school, you work collaboratively with your staff to determine what the learning focus needs to be, and you engage in a process of inquiry to bring about that improvement, supported by your superintendent, supported by the system in coaching and in other ways. That's our foundation. So really then, the system would simply support you in your school. The improvement process is owned by you in the school. And for us to be making system statements about individual contexts might actually jeopardize what we've talked about regarding the kind of leadership conditions we wish to create. Yes, we will say some system things like all students reading by the end of grade 1, or where students aren't reading in grade 4, grade 6, grade 9, we've got to figure out a way to intervene. The notion of a caring adult, which we know is so significant, and our data suggests we have some work to do in this area, is something that is really doable without necessarily finding additional dollars, is something that, again, we can say from a system level. But if we try to say anything that's more specific, in my experience, we might obstruct the work that you need to do. So I'm answering the question by saying we would like to support you, if you happen to be in a middle school, with the kind of work that you need to do in order to bring about your students' success.
Okay, and I guess the same would be for secondary schools as well.
Yes, secondary schools, and again, I know I shared with you in January, I come probably more from a secondary background. Your improvement process is a bit more unique in that we understand that with multiple departments and multiple subject expertise, you actually have to do this improvement work a little differently, in that ensuring that the achievement focus and the well-being focus and the equity focus makes sense across multiple departments. Clearly, when we speak about achievement, we're also including the importance of assessment, and we understand that, again, in your local situation, you need to have some space supported by the system to determine what focus looks like.
If we could stick on the issue of student achievement, John, for a moment, I think we do an excellent job in the TDSB of engaging our parents and our communities, but in spite of all that work, some of our principals and vice principals still point to the fact that there are some parents in some communities who aren't as engaged as they should be in their children's learning. And I know there's no easy answer to this, but what more can we do as a system to try and reach out to these people and get them engaged?
And I'll share a quick story. In the spirit of building relationships at school level, where I believe that is the only way to make this difference, this is actually something that probably doesn't come from a system again. And the reason I say that is I'm not shirking our responsibility at the system level. It's just that when people email me, I can't be necessarily in relationship with them in a personal way. I mean, clearly we're trying to connect through this venue, but it's nothing like when you're actually in your schools, in your hallways, in your offices, connecting with parents and community. The greatest strategy that I have learned about engaging those parents who might not feel comfortable coming through the door or might not feel comfortable attending an evening, a literacy night, or what have you, is to reach out to them, and even if it's a small number of students who are probably struggling the most with achievement, instead of calling them sometimes when there's a problem, simply reaching out to them to say, you know, we want to serve your child, your adolescent. We don't know if we're doing that right now. We need your help. Would you be willing to come in and talk to us about that? I have found in my own experience, and I just share that not to sound idealistic, but unless there's a mental health or an addiction challenge, many parents, even those who aren't engaged, can respond to that kind of invitation. And even if every one of our 588 schools only reached out to 10 parents who might be in that situation, can you imagine how that will exponentially expand our engagement? So at the risk of sounding, again, idealistic, I don't believe we can actually improve engagement unless we actually focus on the relationship piece. And also take into account that some of our families, due to their own experience of school, aren't comfortable with us. It's not personal. They're just not necessarily comfortable with us. So the question becomes, what can we do to potentially change that? It's not an easy answer, and it's one that I hope we can just continue to work at.
Question in from David. Leithwood argues that a strong school district is characterized by a broadly shared mission, vision, and goals founded on ambiguous images and of the educated person. I'm sure we're not there yet. Is there a plan being developed to get us there?
Yes.
Sorry, fumbling through that question.
So actually, I know it may not sound polished yet, because there's an exciting thing about Leithwood's work. And when you look at the Strong Districts work and that shared vision he speaks about, one very clear example of that is that we're a learning organization, which means we're not a static organization, which means that those things that are all polished and laminated might not actually get us to where we want to go. But this is what I'm putting on the table right now. When we create a kind of leadership culture that gets and understands the notion of expertise and experience of all, that understands our role as the formal leader in terms of a coordinating coherence function, if I can use that term. And if we create space for innovation through that leadership, space for collaboration, and space for focus. That, and why are we doing that? Because we believe each and every student deserves to achieve and to improve. That would be, in Leithwood's work, a very clear and strong, compelling vision, shared goal. How do we create that kind of leadership space? That's one idea. The other idea, when we believe so strongly about achievement, well-being, and equity, and when we think about those three things, and we're going to again provide some supports to what this could look like, not in a prescriptive way, but in a process way, so that you can work with your staffs to arrive at that focus, that allows for us then to engage in an authentic learning process. That allows a system to respond in a effective way to your learning process with your students and with your staff. In the Leithwood research, he would argue that those are all the pieces of the puzzle to moving the system forward, supporting schools to make that improvement happen. And I think that actually this plan, though it may not sound or seem fully ironed out yet, and there is more to come, is on the road to making that so. Leadership, culture, coherence, improvement. And I hope that through this discussion in the last hour, you're starting to hear how this is based upon all the great work that has happened in TDSB previously, but it's also trying to focus that work.
Probably have time for maybe 2 more questions. Here, this one was asked by June about 20 minutes ago. How will principal and vice principal transfers movement be effective with all the organizational changes?
Thank you, Mary, for that, and for June for that question. I didn't mention it in the themes because it was something that I probably should have mentioned when you asked me to give some concluding thoughts, and that is the whole notion of the transfer and placement of principals and vice principals has emerged as one of the concerns that many of you hold. And clearly, I need to learn from you more about what those concerns are. I've heard that there is a worry that if you wish to transfer, you have to be open to many, many different parts of the city. And sometimes just that type of thing causes all kinds of challenge because of where you might live and how far you might have to commute. I've heard concerns that there might be some worry if you are engaging honestly in the learning community that could potentially impact placement down the road. I've heard that some of you may still be concerned that our trustee in your area might still be influencing where principals are placed. So I need you to trust, please, and I say that with absolute sincerity, that I think I've heard some of the issues, and we are in the process of working together to figure out what are a couple of the things we could explicitly do to shift that now. So one of the questions that, and I'm saying this with a smile, Mary and Ralph, I sometimes call Mary and Ralph and say, could you find out 3 or 4 things that if they happened, and I'm now going to ask it here, in relationship to transfer and placement, would really make a difference to show our community, to show you that we actually are committed to making this change. That might be a way to start the discussion. You might be able to offer me more insight through our superintendents if we need to, and again, I respect if there still needs to be an anonymity that some of you need to share, then figure out a way, please, to get that information to us. But how about if I answer the question to say, I would like for you to be honored and respected in that process. I would like for system need to also be part of it. I'd like for the collaboration between superintendent, principals, and vice principals to be the ground of this. And where we still have work to do to make that so, let's work together on a couple of things that we can put in place so that all of you feel we're moving in the right direction.
I'll give you one thing. Right now, when you fill out the form, you have to select 10 families of schools, and so that's a lot. And we all know what Toronto traffic is like. And do you want people in their cars for an hour, or do you want them in schools engaging with students? So that's one, just off the top.
And the other thing I know we have to work on is that I've come to understand that some of you experience, whether some of you like this or don't like this, I'm guessing you're on every side of the equation, that if you wish to move to a different family of schools, it sometimes is challenging, or someone might want you to move to a different family of schools and you might not want to. I'll leave this question to say, I think one of the greatest changes, whether you love this or not, is that when we talk about working in learning centers versus simply my family of schools, that's going to bring about a shift. That's going to bring about a shift in terms of how we work together. It's going to bring about a shift in some of these operational practices. And I would simply ask that we take it one step at a time. We're at the point where the guiding principles have been passed by the board. Within the next 2 weeks, I hope to have a structure in place. Within 2 weeks after that, I hope we will able to have some names attached to those structures, and then we can be sure that your voice is heard in terms of how we implement some of our other important work in that context.
Okay. You have time for one more question?
I think we should take. Is there one there? No, I can close it. Why don't I close then with the guiding principle number 12, John, is to enhance service excellence and responsiveness to our communities. And we've had a number of questions, and the recurring theme was, what does service excellence look like, and which groups are you speaking to when you say that we expect service excellence?
So the discussion I've had with all of our managers in what I'll call the service departments, the human resources, the IT, the employee services, and the like, is that it's really important for all of us who work centrally to understand that our mission is students, even though we might not see students on a daily basis. And that our responsibility is to support you as principals and vice principals so you're not distracted by the significant work that you need to do by a lack of response or a lack of access to some of the supports. So part of this discussion with our departments has been to say, how do you see yourself deeply connected to students? That's point number one. Point number two, I believe, again, that where there are relationships, there are abilities to actually move things a lot more quickly. We're exploring right now how the service departments would be in relationship to the centers. We haven't figured all of those pieces out yet, but again, we're starting to see some success in some parts of our board where there is somebody working more locally in terms of a quadrant of schools, actually being in relationship with principals and vice principals, say in a facilities area, and in some cases we're seeing great improvements because of that. Still a long way to go, but we're exploring best practice in that regard. So where we see our service departments connected, at least from vision and strategy, to students, where we have effective relationships where this service can be provided, and where our executive superintendents of the Learning Center have the responsibility, when they hear and understand what's happening, to move some of the central mountains that might exist. And when I say central mountains, I'm now talking about within the board, because again, we are complex, but that's no excuse for you needing to speak to multiple people over multiple days to get a response. We're looking at our standards around communication. We're looking at our standards around how quickly we need to get back to you. And if the answer is no, the answer is no. You need to hear that. But that doesn't mean we're not being responsive. But if we don't answer you at all, then we are not being responsive. So this is all part of the equation, and we're hoping that our service departments connected to our learning centers, specifically listening to your needs, will make some of the difference. But again, please be patient. We've heard you. We're going to figure out some ways to move as quickly as possible, but I know that patience will be required when we make some of the shifts that we're talking about.
Okay. So thank you very much, John, for this conversation. Thank you to all the principals and vice principals that were able to make it onto this call. We appreciate it. We didn't get to all of the questions that were online. We also have 15 pages of questions around the guiding principles. We had questions about what principals and vice principals needed to see and hear in order to believe that the board is making a difference. So we are using these questions. We have a meeting with John next week, and we will continue to advocate on your behalf. Finally, I'd like to thank the communications department in the background here, taking great care of us. And we're going to set up a date, hopefully in April, that we can do this again, and we'll have an agenda. We'll ask for questions again, and this is the beginning. So thank you for this dialogue.
And thank you as well. Much appreciated to all of you as well. Thank you so much for your leadership.